Hello, I'm Jacqueline with SciJoy, and today with me is Tim, the other half of SciJoy, and we have a special guest, Dr. Sara Langworthy. She has a YouTube channel called Developmental Enthusiast, and that's how I found her, and she wrote a book too, which we're going to be discussing. It's called Bridging the Relationship Gap. And we're going to talk about this book, her YouTube channel, writing, and just developmental psychology in general. You can tweet any questions to us at the SciJoy, and you can tweet questions to Sara also. And her Twitter is at the bottom. Do you want to see your Twitter handle? Because I don't remember off the top of my head.
Sure. I'm at Dr. Langworthy, at Dr. Langworthy.
Okay. It's easy enough. So do you want to start off with how you got into developmental psychology?
Yeah, sure. So I was interested in psychology kind of throughout high school and college, and majored in psychology in college, but was also really interested in how the brain works and how the brain changes and grows over time, and so kind of got into the developmental side of things that way, and then ended up doing a research experience for undergraduates program between my junior and senior year of college, and there I got an opportunity to delve into research a little bit more and learned that I really kind of liked it and it was cool. So I got to do some really cool studies using techniques like electroencephalograms and magnetic resonance imaging, so studying how the brain works, put on a little electro cap and measure electrical activity in the brain or take pictures of the brain to see how it's working. And so I kind of got my feet wet in research that way and was really fascinated with the kinds of questions that we could answer with science. And so then applied and got into a program here at the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota and did my graduate work there. Throughout my graduate career, I got to do a lot of cool things, but one of the things that I learned pretty quickly is that I didn't want to go quite the traditional route of going on to become a full-time researcher, and so I got an opportunity to be a part of what's called an exhibit development team, and that was at the Science Museum of Minnesota. They were doing an exhibit all about the science of early childhood. So what do we know about kids, and what do we know about how they grow and change, how they learn, how they think, and they needed somebody to come in and teach them a little bit about the content. And so I got to be a part of this team, which was fascinating and really cool. You know, these folks who do museum exhibits are fabulous. We'd come one week and have this concept that we were trying to communicate to people, like, oh, well, maybe you could do something like this, and then we'd show up the next week and there'd be a prototype sitting on the table, and we'd be like, this is amazing. So it was really fun to get some exposure to thinking about how do you make science accessible to general audiences, and how do you communicate it effectively without watering down science, but by also making it engaging and interesting in very sort of different ways than you might have originally thought. So that was my first experience with sort of thinking about how do we make science really useful for people. And then I finished up my graduate work and started working at a group called the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium here at the university, where we did a lot of research translation kinds of things. And that's where I still am and still enjoying doing some of those kinds of things. And the video stuff has kind of fallen nicely into place there as well. So my YouTube channel is Developmental Enthusiast, and there I talk a lot about child psychology and brain development and all the things I learned lots of stuff about. And I just have a really good time hanging out and talking about those things, and then also meeting all of the cool YouTubers out there like you. So thanks for having me today.
Yep, and if anyone has any questions specifically beyond tonight, they can send you messages, and sometimes you make response videos to questions.
Indeed I do.
And I think in your book you did a great job too of it. In the beginning of the book, I felt like you started out with the sciencey bits, and then you kind of moved on and translated it to how we could use it. So you want to start with some of the sciencey bits, some of the was it clinical trial kind of stuff that was in there?
Yeah, so the book sort of, I can talk a little bit about like how the book came about, because that was
Yeah.
kind of a weird story. So when I was working after graduate school, I got an email from my former research advisor who said, hey, this local publisher contacted me and said they need a content expert to review some of their materials, and I don't have the time to do that. Would you be willing? And I said, okay, I don't know what that means, but sure. And so I worked a little bit with the publisher to review some of their existing material, and some of the science sides of some of the material I was reviewing just were not quite as sharp and accurate as they could be. And so I brought this up to the publisher and I said, hey, I think it'd be really great if you had a science author come in and, really flesh out some of the basic science here around child development and child psychology, because there's a lot we know that though it's complex can still be communicated effectively. And they said, okay, why don't you write a book proposal? And I went, okay. So I felt like that was an opportunity I couldn't say no to. And so two years and change later, I have a book, which is weird. And also very cool. But yeah, throughout the book, I try to connect the science of what we know about little kids and how they think and learn and grow to how people who are working with kids one-on-one, especially young children, can work with them most effectively. And really throughout the book, I talk a lot about trauma and stress and what do we know about what those experiences do for kids. So through, as Jacqueline, as you mentioned, through the first couple of chapters, I try to unpack some of the basics of what do we know from developmental science. So there's a lot about relationships and about attachment relationships and how important those early relationships with parents and caregivers are for setting a foundation for success later in life. And I also talk about what's happening in the brain. The first 5 years of life are a tremendous period of growth and change in the brain. And so, we know a lot about what's happening with neurons that are migrating and then making connections and then pruning away things that aren't as relevant, and how the brain takes in all of these different experiences and really begins to make sense of the world in those first 5 years, and that the context of relationships is a really important one to consider when we're thinking about brain development. In the case of trauma and stress, these are types of experiences that are really chronic and long-lasting and very difficult things that a lot of young children unfortunately have to go through. But those experiences can change how the brain develops, and we've learned a lot about that through things like animal studies. So there are studies about how rats care for their young, and what the amount of licking a mom does with her rat pup. What does that mean for development? And so we've learned a lot from doing these kinds of studies, and as well as doing some basic studies with infants and how they learn, and how do we know what's going on in an infant brain? We can't ask them to tell us. Well, we have devised some cool experiments, and I'll put in a little plug here. I just actually released a video yesterday all about how we study infant learning. So if you're interested in that, you can go check that out on my channel. But yeah, a lot of these initial studies sort of set the foundation for how we think about kids and what they're capable of and the futures that we're setting up for them.
So two of the studies that stuck out in my mind was the imaginary cliff scenario, where you made it an optical illusion, so a baby looked like they were going to crawl off a cliff.
Yep. And
if they had a really good relationship with their caregiver, that the caregiver would just be like, "Come on," and the baby would look down and see the cliff and be like, "I don't know, but it's all right." So the baby would still go. And when they had bad relationships, they were like, "Mm-mm. I don't trust you enough for that." And I found that like pretty interesting.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that one is it's not even as much about the quality of the relationship, it's about the cues that the child is getting from the parent. So if mom is like, "No, yeah, it's fine, you can cross, that's great, like, sure, you're going to be fine," they take that information to mean, "Oh, I'm safe. Mom's got my back, I'm good." Whereas, if dad is looking across at baby and giving like, "Oh no, don't do that. Oh, that's scary. Don't do that." The baby might be more like, "Whoa, I don't know, because I'm gauging the safety of my environment based on the information I'm getting from my caregiver," which is a really kind of complex thing if you think about like what that requires. It requires the baby to have an understanding of what that relationship means and the safety within that relationship. And so, yeah, it's cool how how you can study that by putting a kid on a plexiglass thing and doing a visual experiment with them. But
yeah, and I think you related that back to sometimes parents are going through trauma, and that kind of affects the kid and the safety that they feel because the parents can't deal with their own trauma. And you, for safety wise, you pointed out your own experience with your dad towards the beginning of the book where he was just like, you were freaking out, and he was just like, look, it's all good, it's safe. And
Yep.
then that's what calmed you down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing that's most important to remember when you're working with any kids, but especially kids who've experienced a lot of hardship early in life, is that context of safety. That that reminding children that they're safe and making them feel safe is really important, because for a lot of kids, they get robbed of that. You know, and I think when we think about trauma, there are some big things that we think about, so like natural disasters and terrorism and those kinds of big, you know, news items that happen, and those can certainly be traumatic. But one of the things I talk about in the book is how we think about trauma is important too. So we need to understand that trauma is really in the eye of the beholder, or in the eye of the experiencer. So things that I might think are traumatic to somebody else might not be to them. And so it's always important for us to be thinking about and weighing how we're interpreting other people's experiences. And this also comes in handy when we're thinking about stress. And in the book, I talk about 3 different types of stress that scientists have kind of identified as ways to talk about stress. We've got positive stress, which is like what I'm feeling right now, talking very publicly to all of you about this topic. I'm just feeling a little, you know, got a little bit more adrenaline going on and that sort of thing. But I know after I'm done with the hangout today, I'll come back to normal and feel good again. And then the second category is tolerable stress. So these are experiences like the loss of a loved one, or difficult things that are usually pretty time limited. And the difference between tolerable stress and toxic stress, which I'll talk about in a minute, is your ability to recover from those experiences by relying on your relationships with others and other factors in your life, whether it's your own sense of self-worth or belief in a higher power or whatever it is, that you can rely on those things and cope through that experience. Toxic stress is the really chronic and consistent experiences of stress. So we when we think about toxic stress, we think about things like poverty, homelessness, having a parent who's incarcerated, a job loss. Those kinds of things can have sort of a pile-on effect, and they kind of perpetuate one another as well. And so you kind of end up in a situation where a child is growing up within a context of stress, that is their everyday reality. And so it's important to remember that, you know, though we might perceive something as traumatic, it's important to look through the lens of the child and their context and their experiences as well to really get a handle on what's going on.
And Tim has been monitoring the chat, and he says we have a question. They said, do you think parents limit the exploration and experiment done by children out of fear or safety?
Interesting. Yeah, maybe. I guess I would want to know a little bit more about the context of that. But you know, I think one of the jobs of caregivers early on is to give children information about how to explore the environment, right? So in the book, I talk a lot about serve and return relationships and the back and forth that parents have with their kids early on and how kids learn from that. So like the visual experiment we were just talking about, kids begin to learn what's safe and what's not based on their parents' reactions to things, and parents can sort of help encourage exploration, but they can also hinder it as well. So if parents are fearful or sort of like, oh no, you shouldn't talk to that person, or oh no, you shouldn't do that, or oh, you shouldn't go over there, then that might hinder a little bit the ease with which a child is willing to explore. On the other hand, you could go too far the other direction and just be like, oh yeah, do whatever, and have your child walk out in the street. Also not ideal. So I think there's the balance. And yes, I think the parents both limit and also encourage exploration, and that's an important balance to figure out. I don't have a prescription for that. I don't know what, it depends on the individual child and all of that sort of thing, but it is an important kind of back and forth dance that parents have to do with their kids.
And you talk about other kinds of balance in the book too, like if you don't respond to a baby right away once, it's not going to affect them forever. It's more of a over time kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. There are, I think sometimes in our culture today, we get really concerned about like, oh my gosh, am I parenting my child appropriately? If I ignored them this one time, is that going to mess them up forever? And no, it's not. In general, it's the cumulative effect of all of those interactions, right? So if most of your interactions are positive, you're going to be fine. If most of them aren't, then that's problematic. So, if you think about you're in a restaurant and you're trying to send off an email real quick while your child's having some lunch and they're trying to get your attention, paying attention to your child is important, but it's also, in that moment, maybe more important to get your email off. Now, once you got your email off, then maybe, make sure that you're present and with your child and having those back and forth interactions. But again, don't punish yourself for for having to do other things. Like, your child does not need to be the center of your world at every moment of your existence, is what I would say there, I guess.
Do you want to, I think we got a question from Twitter. Do you want to answer Liz's question? Do you have that pulled up?
Sure. I'm forgetting what it was now.
It's something to do with anger.
Yes. How can you help kids navigate their anger productively? That's such a great question. And it's hard. So one of the things that we know from the research, as well as from professionals who work with young children, is that especially kids who've experienced trauma and stress, but also kids who haven't, have trouble with their emotions sometimes. So sometimes children will act out and you won't know why. You won't know what perpetuated it. Why did they suddenly fly off the handle like that? And so one of the important things that's really valuable is giving children language to talk about their feelings. I was thinking about this the other day, that I know the difference between frustration and anger. Like, I know the difference between how those two things feel for me, but I didn't always know that, right? Like, at some point somebody had to tell me that, well, what you're feeling is anger, and this frustration is a lesser version of anger, and it feels a little bit different, and maybe you use different coping strategies to deal with one versus the other. Maybe one, you go for a run or go talk to a friend, and for the other, maybe you have to think about, how do I resolve this conflict with this person, or whatever it is. So you might use slightly different strategies. Kids aren't born knowing that, and so it's important for us to remember to put words to those feelings, because those feelings can be really big and scary, and acknowledging them and accepting those feelings as being real is a really important thing to do. I think often we sort of lump feelings and behaviors together, where the behavior that comes out of the feeling may not be appropriate, but it's okay for the child to feel the way that they feel. If they feel angry because their classmate pushed them in the hallway accidentally, and so they got angry and hit them back, it's okay for them to feel angry about that, and it's important to identify that what you're feeling angry because he hit you or he bumped into you, but that doesn't mean that we can hit him back. Like, that's not okay. We want everybody to be safe here, and so in order to be safe, we need to make sure that you're not hitting your friend. So how do we help you not do that next time? So it's really a sort of process of problem solving with kids. It's identifying those emotions. It's talking about them honestly. It's acknowledging that they're real. Like, even if you don't understand why it's happening, understanding that for the child it is happening, that's a really important first step. And then starting to have those conversations about how behavior stems from feelings and stems from that sense of being angry, but how we can make different choices to do other behaviors when we feel angry to help us cope with those feelings.
I have one thing that relate back to your book, and then I think we'll look at some comments.
All right.
Tim says there's a lot of good comments, not
Great.
necessarily questions, but comments in the chat going on.
Great.
But one of the things I realized in your book that you said a lot that I really liked was the safe thing. Like, since the kids had trauma, you made it a safe space before they could learn. Like, you didn't just say, you've been bad, go in the corner. You sit down and you said, you're safe, and your behavior is making it unsafe for others, and relating that everyone deserves to be safe. They do, the other kids do, and that was just like something that I found really cool that you used throughout. And something else that I didn't really think about was when you said you talk to the kid and they're telling you their trauma or their emotions or their feelings, like be empathetic, which makes sense, but you said don't show emotion because you don't want them to think it's like way worse or like, and that was something that I had never really thought about. I would probably just kind of react.
Yeah. Well, and those things are really hard. And, I talked to a lot of professionals when I was writing this book about, how do you do these things? And a lot of them said, it's a lot of training and it's a lot of learning how to have those reactions that are appropriate. So if a child tells you, something horrible about their home life or something horrible about something that happened to their brother or sister or to them, you don't want to add to any feelings of anxiety or sadness or anger that they're already having by having your own reaction, right? Because children are really good at mirroring our feelings, as we already talked about a little while ago. Children pick up on that. They're really good at picking up on how adults are feeling and what adults are where they are in the world and that sort of thing. So it's important to acknowledge that a child is feeling a certain way, or that, that experience must have been really scary for you. But it's okay, we're going to be safe here together. Instead of having the, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you, and that's so terrible, and why, you want to make sure that it's a more even response as much as you're able. And that's really challenging in the moment, really, really challenging. But, doing your best to be the strong figure for the child, while also acknowledging that their feelings are real. You don't want to ignore it, but you also don't want to exacerbate it either. So finding that sort of middle ground. One of the things that I find really helpful for talking, especially with teachers, about this idea of thinking about trauma and thinking about children's context and what they're growing up with, is instead of, when we see a behavior we don't like, instead of thinking, well, why did you do that? What's wrong with you? Instead of what's wrong with you, it's shifting the frame to think, what happened to you that was the response you chose, right? So going back to the example of two kids in the hallway, one bumps into the other one loses it and hauls off and hits him. That's, not a super typical response. It would kind of like, why would he react that way? But instead of jumping in and being like, you're the bad kid, why would you do that? Don't hit your friend. It's, okay, what's going on here? It's taking that step back and thinking, okay, what's happening for this kid that's the response I got here, or that's the response, that's the behavior. Making it more questioning can also make it feel less personal. So sometimes when I talk to teachers or parents, it's like, well, my kid they're just out to torment me, and they're just trying to make my life miserable. And that's not usually the case. There are times kids know how to needle. They know what buttons to push. But for the most part, if a child is acting out of control, it's because they feel out of control. It's not because they want to get back at you for that thing that you did. So being able to step back and approach it with a sense of curiosity and sort of wondering about where this child is and what their experience has been can be a helpful way to kind of pull yourself out of the immediate emotion and make it feel less personal to you.
I don't know if you can see the blue chat.
Yeah, so much. Okay.
There's a few things. So starting at the top, high-waisted pantaloon says, I relate finding the balance to raising children to the sport of curling.
That's interesting. And then children do not and should not be the center of your universe and your attention at every second of the day. It's good for them to see that you do other things too, as long as it doesn't turn into neglect. That's a really great point from Practical Poppins. Oh, emotion regulation. Yeah. Helping kids understand and control their emotions is really challenging. Yeah.
And I think towards the end, Matt has a few questions or a question.
Okay. Do they mirror that explaining back with words too? I'm not entirely sure what you're asking here, but I'm going to take a stab at it anyway, Matt. So clarify if I'm not hitting this. So part of the giving children language piece is that they begin to then take on that language to then describe their own feelings. So initially, especially if you're working with kids who are highly stressed, they'll have a behavioral reaction, they'll lose their minds and go run off to the corner or whatever. It's an ongoing process, but eventually through this sort of one-on-one coaching and acknowledging emotions and talking about emotions and safety and how we control our behaviors and that sort of thing, you eventually can get to a point where children are able to then say to you, I'm really mad right now, or I'm really frustrated right now. Before, they would just behave, they would act, and that would be them communicating with you. But you can get children to a point where they can actually start to express their own emotions using words, but you have to give them that language first. So let me know if that doesn't answer the question.
We'll wait for him. I'll bring up something else towards the end of the book that you talked about, not just you acknowledging like one-on-one, but one of the examples you gave was a child said like, my mom or dad is incarcerated, and at first you said the teacher just moved on, but a better way to do it would be to be like, oh, well, I'm really sorry to hear that, and you focused on like, your parent is not a bad person, they did a bad thing, and instead of letting the other children like kind of berate that kid, you talk about it so the other children know how to behave and create a safer environment for that kid to kind of talk.
Yeah, it's really hard to talk about some of these taboo topics, and until recently, and even still, parental incarceration is one of those topics. So if a child has a parent who's incarcerated, there are a whole lot of complexities to wade through. The child may not even know, or not even supposed to know, that the parent is in prison or in jail. But they may get a story about, oh, they're going off to college or something like that. So there may not even be honesty within the home about some of those conversations. But if they do know and they're able to talk about that, then there's this whole feeling from general society and maybe messages that other children in the classroom are getting about people who go to prison are bad. And only bad people go to prison, and it becomes a very sort of hot button issue. And so, how do you, as a teacher, navigate that in the moment if one of your kiddos gets up and says, my mom's in jail? Okay, how do you do that? I would say instead of ignoring it and moving on to something else, that you address that and acknowledge that that's a reality for that child, and that like you said, I'm sorry to hear that, or that must be very hard for you, that must be difficult, and making sure that you're able to have that conversation in a way where other children understand that just because their parent did a bad thing doesn't mean that they're bad forever. Like that doesn't mean that parent loves their child any less. It doesn't mean that they won't get out of prison or jail and turn into a perfectly respectable parent who wants to raise their children well. It might not be the case too, but it's important to allow children to grapple with some of that complexity a little bit. These are difficult topics, and sometimes Sometimes I think we water down too much to the point where it becomes too black and white, which sort of sets us up in the future for having these kind of really difficult battles and conversations about, things like incarceration, for example. So the more we can have those open and honest conversations, the better. But I will say that there are cases where, you need to be careful about that too, and respecting families' wishes about how to talk about that. So again, with a child who's incarcerated, or a child who has a parent who's incarcerated, it's often good to check in with the caregiver of that child about what the child knows and about the situation as much as you can, so that you have a sense for what the child's aware of and what they're not, so that you're not bringing things up that you shouldn't be. So it's a difficult thing to navigate that, but being able to have a space for those open and honest conversations in a way that children can understand and appreciate is important.
One of the other really difficult ones you pointed out that was probably something else you have to talk to the other guardians was one girl, her mom committed suicide and she was making art for her and saying, I'm going to give this to my mom today, like couldn't quite grasp that her mom wasn't still around.
Yeah, and that one's pretty common, especially for younger children, that there's a period where it's difficult for children to grasp that. I mean, if you think about death is permanent, and sometimes we talk about, oh, well, they just went to sleep forever, which again is sort of watering it down a little. Like, as much as it's difficult to be honest with children about these difficult things, sometimes that's the best strategy. Not always, but sometimes. And so thinking long and hard about how do you talk to children about death, and how do you talk to children about, losing somebody or a parent going off to the military or any of those things, it's important to be thinking about honesty and what messages your children get from the way that you talk about those things.
In the comments, Matt said thank you, and that did answer his question, and then he brought up some more stuff. He said it kind of reminds me of John Green saying criminals aren't bad people, they're complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And 'tis hard to tell delicate truths to young kids. Indeed.
Yep. And then I think Liz has a comment too.
Yeah, let's see. Take a second and breathe. Yeah, so I'm working with my daughter to get her to take a second and breathe before she gets too emotional or causes harm. Yeah, and those kinds of strategies are really great. Think about the things that you as an adult have learned about how to effectively cope with those things, and those are the things to teach your kids. We all have them. We all have those strategies. Some of them better than others, some of them better strategies than others, but it's important to be thinking about what are those things and how do I communicate those and how do I help my kids learn those things.
Are there other resources people could go to if they need? I know one of the reasons you said you wrote the book was for people to have resources, but are there other places you would point people out?
Yeah, so if you have a specific interest in childhood trauma and stress specifically, or if you or somebody you know is dealing with a lot of trauma and stress, of course now I'm not going to remember the full title. I believe it is the National Child and Traumatic Stress Network. It's nctsn.org is a really great place. It's got a lot of really helpful resources around different kinds of trauma. So one thing I didn't talk about a whole lot here is that there are different kinds of trauma, and though in general the response to trauma is pretty consistent across the board, which is maintaining safety and having conversations and working with kids through their complex emotions, there are some cases that are a little bit more challenging. And so NCTSN has a lot of great resources for working with kids in those different contexts. If you're interested in just learning more about early childhood development and what do we know about little kids and how they think and how they learn, I would recommend Harvard University's Center for the Developing Child, Center on the Developing Child, one of those. You can just Google it, and they have a ton of really great stuff, a lot of great videos, a lot of great research papers that are accessible and public, and available, but are written in a way that general public can understand, and people who, if you don't have a huge background in psychology, you'll still be able to read and understand a lot of these papers. I cite a lot of those in the book. It's like every other line was like, Harvard, they know stuff. No, but they have a lot of really great resources, so I definitely recommend checking those things out.
And you started making videos for your organization you work with, right?
Yes.
Don't you guys have a lot of resources?
Yeah,
Also?
so we do as well. So the Extension Children, Youth, and Family Consortium, we are here at the University of Minnesota, and we have a lot of stuff on trauma and stress. We talk about things like historical trauma, which is this idea that trauma of generations past can be carried forward across generations, which is sort of not a new idea, but it's one that's beginning to kind of become a conversation that's starting to happen, which is good and important. And there are some other videos and things that we've done around thinking about children's mental health and well-being as a public health issue, that it's not just about one individual child and their family. It's actually their health is important to all of us, and why that is, and how we as a society more generally can begin to support and really promote the health and well-being of kiddos across the lifespan. So yes, can we put links to these things in description section or something so that people afterwards want to do that? Yeah, we can definitely put links to that stuff.
And Practical Poppins has another question for us.
Pretend or role play. Okay, so as a caregiver, if I were to work with or for a family where there's a primary family member who is incarcerated, how healthy is it for a child to pretend or role play? Is it possible to talk about it too much? I don't have a great answer to this. I would say, pretend play is something that kids naturally do, and it's something that they're usually working out things that are happening in their lives. So in the book I talk a little bit about this within the context of like neighborhood violence. So if kids are experiencing a lot of neighborhood violence, or they're living in a home where you have gang members coming in and out, they might see guns regularly, they may bring that play with them to daycare. So that it's important to sort of recognize that when it comes up, and again maintain safety, right? So say a child's saying, I'm going to shoot you or whatever. Again, it's that maintaining a boundary of like, well, we don't play that way here. We want to make sure everybody's safe, and playing with guns isn't safe. So coming back to that safety piece is important. Within the context of incarceration, a child may be sort of exploring a little bit about what they think might be happening with their parent, or what they're hearing about what's happening with their parent. So, I wouldn't say that it's harmful, and in some ways it's sort of a natural process for children to be working through that. But again, maintaining that message of safety and that message of, though your mom or dad is incarcerated, we're going to keep you safe here, and they're going to, the people who are supervising your mom or dad, they're going to do everything they can to keep them safe too. And having some conversations about that, I think is fine. But yeah, I think it can get too perseverative. You want to make sure that kids aren't dwelling too much on some of these topics, and so gently redirecting to some other types of play can be effective as well. But keeping in mind that play is sometimes the way that kids work through some of the things they're experiencing in life.
And your Project for Awesome video was on incarceration too, right?
Yeah. So I did a Project for Awesome video for this last year, all about an organization here in town called the Minnesota Prison Doula Project. So this organization works with pregnant incarcerated women who are either about to give birth or either will give birth while they're incarcerated or shortly thereafter, and they do prenatal courses and prenatal care, and are also these doulas are able to be with these moms when they give birth, which is sounds maybe shocking, but is a big deal. Normally, when women are incarcerated and they're giving birth while they're incarcerated, they will only have an officer in the room. They don't get family or friends or anybody else there. So it was a really big shift in state policy, actually, to allow women to access birth doulas when they were incarcerated. And so, yeah, if you're interested in that topic and about prenatal health and care in the context of incarceration, you can check out that video. It's on my channel as well.
So it's getting to be like 45 minutes in. Do you want to start wrapping up and we'll take some final questions? Because I know it takes a while for people to ask some questions.
Sure thing.
So any last minute questions that you guys have for Sara, you can send it to us. And like I said before, if you're watching this later or you think of something later on, you can send Sara a tweet and she will either answer it via that or maybe your video. Or do you want to plug your Medium page too?
Sure.
You've been writing a bunch of stuff on there lately, I think.
Yeah, I have a blog on Medium. If you just go to medium.com, and I think it's /Dr. Langworthy, I believe. So same as my Twitter, but it's also on my YouTube page and all of that as well, so you can get that link. But there I've written about a couple of things, mental health being one of them, and also career paralysis, one thing I didn't really talk about. but the whole, what do you do after graduate school, and how do you make a career if you don't want to do the traditional academic track and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in any of those kinds of things, I've got some videos on that, but also you can check out my Medium blog. I've got some stuff there. I'm also excited for an upcoming video where I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience, and I'm super excited because it involves Harry Potter.
And I think it's pretty important. A lot of times, I know when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, there was only certain places you could go look, but nowadays you can find people like Sara, and if you want to become a psychologist and you want to know what should I research, or like you said, you got to go do a lot of cool stuff with different equipment, knowing who to ask and how to do that. Like, how did you get that opportunity? Did you meet a teacher that allowed you to do that? Did you just like walk by a lab and you're like, I want to do that?
That looks cool. Well, so the research experience for undergraduates program, that was a program that I went on the internet and I was like, I think I might want to do research, and how do I do this, and I don't know anything about it, and sort of stumbled upon it. So I would echo what you just said, which is that the internet now makes this so much easier for you to find things and find resources and communities. So one of the communities that I've stumbled on more recently on Twitter is there's several hashtags, but I think it's hashtag #ALTAC, ALTAC. It's a group that talks about alternate careers other than the traditional academic track for people who are doing specifically doctorates, but also master's degrees as well. What do you do after graduate school if you don't want to do the traditional track? That's not always clear to people. That's not something that's laid out, and there's a lot of sort of pressure and stress on the traditional job track, and a lot of people are recognizing that it's going to be a long road to hoe if you want to go that direction, and so they're starting to look for other options. So there are these communities that have popped up on the internet that really help people think about what are my options and how do I explore them and how do I find them. So yeah, it's the internet.
So just like new jobs are popping up all the time, like people can be YouTubers now. Are there new jobs in psychology that are now things that weren't there like a few years ago that you can think of? Not specifically, but what I will say about that in general within psychology, but kind of across the board, is that especially when you go and get a PhD, the skills you learn and the things that you're able to do after you come out of a PhD are way bigger than your content area that you studied. So thinking about the skills that you've acquired more broadly is really helpful. And it's hard because you're sort of in graduate school, you get pigeonholed into this tiny little thing. But thinking about,
the software programs that you've learned and the ability for you to take in complex information and write about it effectively. Maybe there are sort of specialized techniques that you learned. Like I, for a while, knew how to run an MRI scanner. Like weird, right? But it's an experience that I had in graduate school. So there are those kinds of skills that you pick up along the way. But there are also the more sort of inherent life skills that you learn too, about how to prioritize your time and how to work effectively and how to project manage with other people. Usually in a graduate lab you have to work with other people, and so maybe you're a team leader or maybe you're a team support person or you work with undergraduates. So all of those things are really valuable skills that we don't often, when we're talking about traditional CVs, like those don't show up on your CV as much. And so thinking about how those skills are marketable in the open job market can help you expand a little bit what you're thinking about or how you might take the next step in your career. There are a lot of nonprofits and that sort of thing that do for work with child psychology as well as psychology in general. There are a ton of groups that do things related to that. And so if you're able to talk about how you have excellent project management skills because you ran your own dissertation study and then wrote about it, like that's huge. So make sure that you're thinking about and capitalizing on those skills because you have them.
And then I guess one of the last things I'll ask you about, and we'll see if we get any more questions, is the process of writing. So do you have any tips for anybody if they want to, because I know we talk about on our other channel, We Create EDU, how to make something educational and entertaining on a video form, but we never really got to talk about how do you write a whole book that's like engaging and entertaining. So do you have any tips for writers in general, or do you want to talk any more about your writing process?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. It was an interesting process. I will say that having done a dissertation prepared me really well for writing a book, because in a dissertation it's like 150 pages. You have to crack it down into smaller pieces and take on each of those pieces individually. You can't write it all in a day, turns out. And so the book was the same way. It was thinking about, okay, what are the issues I want to talk about, and then delving into each of those topics individually. The thing that was different about the book was the editing process. So when I sent the original manuscript to the publisher to have them have a content person read it, I also sent it to a bunch of my colleagues, who I chose very specifically because I knew they would be nice to me, but would also give me really great feedback. So I sent it to a handful of people, and the book, as it looked then, is very, very different to how it looks now, and I'm really grateful for that because it's a better book than it would have been. But that process of sort of opening up yourself to other views when you've been living with this thing for so long, you're like, it's my baby, please don't crush it. That's hard. As one of my good friends says, that having somebody else read your writing is kind of like having them take a peek in your underwear drawer, and it's really true. So I would say for aspiring writers, breaking up the project into smaller chunks is really the best advice I have. It's not always easy, and some days you'll sit down and you're like, I don't want to write this section. And so figuring out whether that's just you're avoiding writing this section because you don't want them to write this section, or whether that's because you're just not feeling inspired there and you need to shift to a different part, allowing yourself some flexibility but breaking it up into chunks, and then being open to the feedback that you're going to get from people who are going to edit it, because a book is never just its first draft, which is good because it makes books better, but it can be a bit of a journey, and you have to sort of sift through those edits and think about, okay, do I want to take this edit? Do I not? And that's a long process as well, but a very fulfilling one, and one that's worth it.
I think that is really good advice for anybody that wants to start writing some either fiction or nonfiction, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, and tools, you are the one who got me onto Scrivener, which I wish I had when I was writing a book.
Yeah, Scrivener is very, very cool.
Yeah, so if you're looking for a good writing tool, Scrivener.
And don't worry, it's going to have an app someday.
Woohoo!
They say.
Awesome.
So do you have any final words that you want to say?
I don't think so. Just thanks to everybody who took the chance or took the opportunity to watch. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
If you have any questions for me after the fact, just get a hold of me. I am reachable, and I just appreciate all that you all do for kids and families.
And thank you guys for hanging out with us in the chat. And I will also put a link to how you can get this book, because hopefully this very much intrigued you. I know some people in the chat also have copies of this book and they're reading along too. So
Yay!
Thank you everyone for hanging out with us. Thank you so much, Tim, for watching the chat and sending us all the well, we have one last question.
One more.
From Liz.
Oh, what can we do large scale? Yay, great question. Ended with a bang. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in our work is that, children aren't growing up in a vacuum. So everything from the neighborhoods we grow up in, the schools that we go to, the society that we live in, the internet, the culture, all of those things are having influences on kids. And so what is it that we, on a large scale, the sort of collective we, can do to help children, especially who are going through really difficult life experiences? I think the first thing is awareness, right? So being aware that children that you maybe run into in your neighborhood, if they're acting like the bad kid, it may not be because they're a bad kid. It may be because of what they're going through in their lives. On a more global scale, I think it's thinking about what are the policies and larger sort of social forces that can be moved toward doing good for children and families, and providing them the access to services that they need, and sort of providing equitable access across all kinds of lines. And that's a hard thing to do, and it's a hard thing to do because of the political context we live in, but it's just a difficult conversation because it is really complex, and there's not a single silver bullet answer. And so I guess I would just encourage people to think critically and think openly about different ways of bettering the lives of kids and families that you see every day.
I think that's an excellent point to land on, because it's not just caregivers or teachers who's responsible.
Yep.
Like you said, it's all of us. So.
Yep. It's all of our responsibility.
Thank you so much for hanging out with us, and thank you to everyone in the chat. So have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.